Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians and rightful owners of the land on which we're all Zooming from today. So for me, this includes the Yorta Yorta peoples and the Bangarang peoples. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any First Nations people who may be listening tonight. So once again, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for attending our event tonight about the importance of sign language in the community. We're going to be hearing from a group of really fantastic speakers, and we're also incredibly grateful to have partnered with the AUSLAN Company to put this event together tonight. So just a quick introduction, in case you haven't heard of us at Halad to Health before. We're an Australian not-for-profit, and we run Australia's most affordable GAMSAT and MMI tuition services, where all of the profits raised from tuition fees go directly towards the Halad to Health Foundation in the Philippines, which helps give access to proper health education to students in the Philippines. So you can see a little bit of our impact to date. But yeah, since starting up in January 2019, we've had over 122 GAMSAT students whose tuition fees have helped raise over $20,000, which has helped provide health education and health promotion for over 4,000 students. We'll link a little bit more information about Halad towards the end for anybody who would like to find out more. So I'll talk about our speakers, but first I'll just really quickly introduce myself. So I'm Jules, and I'm the events manager here at Halad. I'm in my second year of medicine at the University of Melbourne, and I'm doing my placement in Wangaratta at the moment. I'm here tonight with Sarah, who's our head of GAMSAT and MMI at Halad, and she's going to be helping out by sending some links in the chat from time to time. So make sure you keep an eye on that. But more importantly, here are our fantastic speakers for tonight. So first of all, we have Jessica, who's a researcher in the field of disability studies and a really passionate advocate for increasing use of AUSLAN and sign language in the community. We're then going to hear from Libbi, who's a speech pathologist and a keyword signer, and who has experience with patients who experience a range of communication barriers. And finally, we've got Josh, who is a PhD student who is passionate about disability and mental health within the deaf community. And finally, we'd like to say a really huge thank you to Emma, who is our interpreter for the evening. So now really quickly onto our partners for the event, the amazing AUSLAN Company. So we're going to hear a little bit more from Darren, who runs the AUSLAN Company, a little bit later. But they've really generously offered 20 of their level 1 Learn AUSLAN online courses to 20 of tonight's attendees, which is so exciting. So in order to go into the draw to win, you need to attend tonight's event until the end and fill out our feedback form at the end of the event. From there, 20 people who have filled it out will be randomly selected to win. Even if you're not one of the lucky winners tonight, we really encourage you to sign up for this course. As we're going to learn tonight, learning AUSLAN or other alternative methods of communication is really crucial for a more inclusive society that helps promote accessibility for all. So it's really a great thing to try and do if you're able to. So now it's time to start our event. Just before I introduce our first speaker, Jessica, if you've got any questions throughout the event for our speakers, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we can address them at the end of each speaker. So our first speaker for tonight is Jessica, who's a non-fiction writer and researcher in the field of life writing and deaf and disability studies. So over to you, Jessica. We're very excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and a real privilege to speak alongside Libbi and Josh as well. And to be speaking about issues that are really dear to my heart as well. So thank you very much for having me. Today, I'm going to be talking about improving accessibility for people in the deaf community, but I actually wanted to begin in a way that's a little bit unorthodox and read a story that comes from a memoir that I'm writing at the moment. And I grew up with two deaf sign language using grandparents, and they were very dear to me. I grew up with them living next door to me. And so this memoir that I'm writing talks about my relationship with them, and more broadly about the idea of the hearing line, which is basically a cultural boundary or barrier that exists between deaf and hearing people and deaf and hearing cultures. And I'm really, really interested in the ways that we can navigate that line attentively and with due care. I actually have some slides that I'm going to put up, if that's okay. Let me see if I can get this to work before I begin. And it's going to the end. Fantastic. Now, does that work if I click like so?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant. Okay. So the reason I'm doing this is because I think, the personal often intersects with the political. And I also find that stories can really animate experience. So I'm going to read you a short section of the manuscript that's taken from a much bigger piece called A Sense of You. And then I'm going to unpack some of the things that it raises. So here's a story to set the scene, if you like. And this is chapter 1 from the text. It's called The Long Goodbye. It's the first time I've actually read this to a group of people, so bear with me. All right. When I told my grandfather he was dying, translating the doctor's prognosis from English into sign language, he smiled and shrugged his shoulders. I've had a good, long life, he said. With my hands, I explained that he was in multiple organ failure after a cardiac arrest, relaying how he'd been unconscious for several days and that his condition was critical. Grandpa nodded, moving his gaze between me and the white-haired physician standing at his bedside. Once we were left alone, Grandpa took hold of my fingers by way of thanks and squeezed them tight. It made sense to me and to the members of my family that I'd be the one to deliver this news. Having studied AUSLAN a few years beforehand, my signing skills were the most developed, and with the exception of Nanny, Grandpa understood me best. His two children, my mum and my Uncle Ray, were emotionally and physically drained after months of keeping vigil in various hospitals and eventually a nursing home. My grandmother, being deaf too, couldn't interpret for him if she'd wanted to. Grandpa had been sick for many years. His chronic emphysema meant he was often carted in and out of emergency departments. Before his final stay in hospital, he could barely walk, and we pushed him around in a wheelchair Mum bought from eBay. On New Year's Day, Grandpa woke, unable to breathe, and an ambulance was sent for him. He was monitored for heart troubles that weren't improving. We had 5 months with him after that, but he never returned home. In that last stretch, my family members shared the load, organising between us that someone be present wherever possible to ensure that Grandpa had an advocate. Often, hospital staff had no clue how to interact with him, despite the communication tips my mother plastered on the walls of the institution. Melvin Hunt is deaf, her handwritten signs read. He cannot hear you, even if you shout. We grew tired of reminding people to get his attention before speaking, to look at him, or to use the pens and pads of paper we'd left so that Grandpa could understand and respond. The double whammy of age and language barrier meant that his care was often compromised. One night, early in his hospital stay, Grandpa had 2 blood transfusions without knowing what was going on. By the time I arrived in the morning, he was wild with panic, vomiting blood and begging for answers. Nobody had explained what was wrong or why he'd needed the transfusions. He could only watch and wonder. By late March, he was sent to the aged care facility, having failed rehab, and in late April, he was rushed back to emergency. His death didn't blindside us. It was neither sudden nor unexpected. We had 3.5 weeks with Grandpa after the heart attack, some of which he was lucid and even joked with the nurses on the ward. All of us, Nanny, my parents, my siblings, my cousins, my aunt and uncle, watched on as he slipped in and out of consciousness, waking for occasional sips of beer and lemonade. Those who are familiar with deaf culture talk about the phenomenon of the long deaf goodbye, where the ritual of farewelling one another stretches on and on, far longer than in hearing interactions. Grandpa was unhurried in saying goodbye to his family. I like to think he was holding on to us just that little bit longer, savouring those last embraces and tidbits of conversation. It took me much longer to say goodbye, and perhaps that process is eternal, bottomless and rough-hewn. Grief, as Joan Didion writes, has no distance. Grief comes in waves, paroxysms, sudden apprehensions that weaken the knees and blind the eyes and obliterate the dailiness of life. It has been a year now since he died, and it has taken many such paroxysms for me to gather a sense of what his life meant, a sense of what he meant to me. So that's the end of story time. Let me just see if this is, there we go. So the events that I've narrated here took place in 2019, pre-COVID. And if this had taken place even a year later, I think the use of masks in these contexts would have complicated things even further. Nevertheless, my family's experience in various hospitals in Sydney and then in the aged care system where my grandfather eventually died was far from positive. Obviously, end-of-life situations are incredibly difficult for everyone involved, but the expected difficulty in this case was compounded by repeated communication breakdowns. And as I mentioned in my story, my grandfather underwent a couple of blood transfusions without any knowledge of what was going on. No interpreters were called and no family members were present, which basically undermined his capacity for informed consent in this situation. But my general sense over these months spent in the healthcare system was that there was very little deaf awareness in these spaces. There were huge communication barriers and gulfs of understanding between my grandfather and the people that were taking care of him. And there was actually one physiotherapist who was wonderful, and she made a really big effort to try and overcome some of these barriers. So she downloaded an app on her phone and learned a couple of basic signs. So things like thank you or pain, for example. There were a couple of others as well, and that made just the world of difference to my grandfather. He felt humanized for a moment. But too often, unfortunately, he was ignored. He was left alone and not interacted with. And the medical staff treated him either as if he was senile, incompetent, or intellectually challenged, none of which he was. Deaf people often end up as the last people to know about their own affairs. And the doctor who treated Grandpa after the heart attack didn't want to inform him about what had happened. It was his medical perspective that Grandpa was terminal, and he shared those views with the members of my family, but he never actually went into the room to address my grandfather. And at that stage, Grandpa was conscious and he was asking repeatedly what was going on and what was going to happen next. And my family members decided that he had a right to know. And so we actually asked the doctor to come back in and speak to my grandfather directly. And that was the conversation that I relayed in the piece that I just read to you. Perhaps others might disagree with this choice, but we felt it was his right to know all information that concerned him. There have been many other occasions where I've been kicked out or not allowed into emergency rooms to interpret for my grandfather. And I've had to protest and kick and scream to get doctors to understand just how essential it is for someone to be present in those situations, especially because they are so stressful. Ideally, of course, you'd have a qualified interpreter, but there are systemic issues there. Sometimes they don't arrive on time, and there are sort of gaps of time where information is just not being received. So Failing an interpreter being present, it's a really great thing to have a family member present at the very least. And having access to information in your first language is critical and can really alleviate the uncertainty and the pretty genuine fear that deaf people experience when dealing with the healthcare system. Now, I'm certainly not a doctor and certainly not a medical kind of doctor, but having witnessed my grandfather's treatment over the last few years, I can attest to the fact that AUSLAN, even just a tiny bit of it, goes a really, really long way. Okay, there we go. So there's a bit of an ideological divide that underpins a lot of these issues, and there's a real tension between medical understandings of hearing loss that identify deafness as a deficit to be cured, and the sociocultural understandings that many deaf people have about their own condition. Many deaf people, particularly those who use sign language and grow up in the deaf community, don't perceive themselves to be disabled. Rather, they see themselves as part of a cultural and linguistic minority group, and they take pride in their deafness and they see it as an integral part of their identity and what makes them them. And the deaf congregate regularly. They form a close-knit community, united by shared customs and values and a way of being in the world. They often speak of the idea of deaf gain, or the idea that there are benefits to being deaf. So, for example, being able to sign to one another in really noisy environments, or to delight in a hypervisual sensory universe, for example. Many don't want to be fixed and they really resent this implication. And for this reason, cochlear implants were once very controversial and often rejected by the deaf community. They were seen at worst as a form of cultural genocide. Nowadays, though, many deaf people have implants and adopt them alongside their deaf identities. It's important to remember, though, that implants are not a miracle fix-all and that listening through them or through hearing aids is really exhausting, especially in noisy environments. And lip reading too is really taxing on the individual, and AUSLAN, or Australian Sign Language, is just able to kind of cut through a lot of these barriers. So it's a really handy tool. Nevertheless, lip reading is a really important strategy for many deaf people. My grandmother, for example, is an excellent lip reader, and she relies very much on seeing people's faces when she's communicating. There are limits to lip reading though, and responding is perhaps one of them. Some people really don't like to vocalize and much prefer to sign, which can pose a problem in these situations. But beyond this, lip reading is estimated to be only 30% accurate. So many words like dog, dark, duck, for example, can look really similar when you're reading them on the lips and can cause confusion. And a young deaf woman named Rachel Kolb discusses lip reading really vividly. So she says that the word lip reading implies reading like reading a book whose text is legible and clear. But the human face is not a book, and lip reading isn't reading. People mumble and talk quickly. They unknowingly cover their mouths or have facial hair like porcupines, lips like sphincters. Lip reading is like putting together a puzzle with missing pieces. So it's important to note that for many deaf people, though this can be helpful, it's just not a substitute for AUSLAN. So I thought it might be useful, especially because my understanding is that many of you here are medical students, just to have a couple of communication tips, in case you end up with a deaf patient that crosses your path. So if you do see the word deaf on someone's chart, it's a really good idea, first of all, to ask what their communication preferences are. So deaf people are not homogenous. They have their own kind of preferences when it comes to communication. And it's a really good thing to ask, whether they prefer to lip read or to have things written down, or if they want an interpreter present, things like that. But my grandfather, for example, was very happy to write things down. So we always had pen and paper at hand, and the pad was exchanged back and forth between people that came into contact with him. And many of his best doctors actually utilized this method, and Grandpa was very happy with that. But other things that are really important are eye contact. So maintaining eye contact in deaf culture is really, really important, especially because it's a visual language. So when you look away from a signed conversation, you miss information. So, maintaining eye contact is really important in these conversations. But even if you're not signing, it's a sign of respect for the deaf person to just maintain some eye contact there. Another really important thing to think about is speaking at a normal pace. So a lot of people, my friends included, who really mean the best, often slow down their speech to a point that it really drags. And that's actually quite difficult for someone to lip read. Similarly, if you shout or yell, it distorts your lip patterns. So speaking at a normal volume and pace is really helpful. You're actually assisting the deaf person by doing that. Also being, and in those situations, it's really good to enunciate clearly. So, don't mumble, don't cover your mouth like this, and think about visual disturbances as well. So you always want to make sure there's kind of nothing in between you and the person that you're speaking to. Think about the light as well. So being backlit is really difficult for a deaf person to read your face, even your facial expressions, but particularly your lip patterns. If the light is coming front on, then they can see you. If you're backlit, they won't be able to read you. So my grandparents, when I was a kid, were constantly doing this, like, move, we can't see your face. So that's a good thing to sort of pivot depending on where the light is coming from. And when you're using an interpreter, it's really, really important to address the deaf person themselves. So I think it's quite a potentially confronting experience for a lot of people who haven't used an interpreter before. But the best thing to do is to keep your eyes on the person that you're addressing, and that interpreter will make sure that they can be seen by the deaf person. So it's, for example, you don't want to do the sort of, oh, could you please tell that person that blah, 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 you want to be looking at the person. And not to slow down too much either, because interpreters are very well trained in keeping up with normal pace of conversation. So that's just a couple of things. I'm sure Josh, who's going to speak to you later, could think of many, many others, and maybe he can elaborate further, but they were just some that I came up with. But more currently, I suppose, we've been seeing a lot of AUSLAN on our screens, and COVID updates have become a daily part of our lives, especially in the last 12 months. And this has meant that, the increased visibility of AUSLAN has had a huge impact on the lives of deaf Australians. It means that they've got critical health and safety information in their first language. But this upswing in accessibility has also had other unexpected impacts. So the Deaf Society and Deaf Services of New South Wales reports that enrolments in AUSLAN courses have risen by more than 400% since the pandemic began. And they attribute this directly to COVID and the increased visibility of signing on the national stage. And this is amazing in many, many ways, but it's also really important that interest in the language doesn't become tokenistic or a bit of a gimmick. So during my childhood, things were very different. I heard people use the word spastic to describe my grandparents' movements. They were often mocked behind their backs because they couldn't hear them, but I heard it, and that was quite horrible. But nowadays, I don't tend to hear as much of that. When I sign in public or when I'm speaking about my grandparents, a lot of people sort of sit upright and they mention the interpreters that they've seen on the TV, or, when they've been to a concert and there's been an interpreter interpreting song lyrics, or a theatre performance or something like that, they say, oh, that was really cool. They might liken sign language to a dance or comment on how beautiful the language is. And they're absolutely not wrong. But I think it's a little bit problematic potentially, especially given the fact that a lot of interpreters have gained a sort of cult-like status, or a cult-like following, I suppose, as a result of their online presences and the presence at press conferences as well. And one Melbourne interpreter was recently dubbed a quiet Adonis after he attracted the admiration of admirers online. But yeah, I guess I'm just flagging the fact that it's important to recognise that AUSLAN's more than a kind of a faddish hobby. It's a vital means of communication, and also a huge point of cultural pride for deaf people. And one thing I really want to flag is, I guess, the fraught history of deaf people in our nation, and of the language itself. So there are about 30,000 deaf people using AUSLAN to communicate in Australia. The Numbers of people with hearing loss are much, much higher, of course. But widespread AUSLAN coverage is a relatively new phenomenon. And though in many states, interpreters have appeared in emergency broadcasts since about 2011 during the Queensland floods, it's only very recently that the nation has adopted this practice in a widespread way. There's no legislation that mandates interpreting in news programs at the moment. And while this is exclusionary, it's not surprising given that AUSLAN is still not a national language. The Australian government recognised it as a community language in 1987, and it's going to be counted in the 2021 census as a language option. But the deaf community continue to lobby for greater recognition and greater access. A full status for AUSLAN as an official language like they have in New Zealand would provide legal safeguards and really important recognition for deaf Australians. But the fact that Australia lags behind in this regard speaks to the very fraught and often overlooked history of deaf people in our country. So for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, signing was banned in schools for deaf children. Deaf children were actually punished for using their native language. They were caned, they had their hands sat on or stomped on. They were forced to have their hands tied behind their backs in ways that were rather inhumane, I guess. And, you know, this was the punishment for doing something that came very naturally and intuitively to them. So this has left really lasting wounds for a lot of particularly older members of the deaf community, my grandparents included. Signing back then was thought to be primitive, almost kind of savage and animal. It wasn't seen as equal to spoken language. And so students were physically coerced to adopt hearing norms. They were taught to speak and listen in those kinds of ways. So understanding, I guess, this history is a really important thing, I think, for anyone wanting to learn. I think it's wonderful that people would want to learn, but I guess it's worth keeping that history in mind. And if you are going to learn, signing up with a registered training organisation is really important because often these institutions or these organisations, they have deaf history as part of the course. So they'll teach you sort of deaf awareness and deaf history. And I think that's a really great place to start. So I won't bang on too much, but I just thought I'd leave a bit of time for questions if anyone had any. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for your incredible talk. In particular, you know, your personal story and your grandfather's personal story was so powerful, and all of the tips that you've given us, I think that was so valuable. I'll give people a chance to pop some questions in the chat if they've got them now. But we've also had some questions come through when people were signing up. And one of the themes that's kind of come up quite a bit, which I think you've touched on a little, is in terms of like wearing masks now so much in healthcare settings and the impact that that has and how we as healthcare practitioners or future healthcare practitioners can kind of navigate that to still, you know, be as improve access to lip reading.
Yeah, I think that's a really big issue. I think masks are quite prohibitive for deaf people. I actually was with my grandmother a few months ago. She had to have an injection in her knee, and the physician who was doing that injection had a mask on the entire time. And I was almost not allowed into that room. And I said, no, she won't be able to understand you because you've got a mask on. And they said, oh no, we'll let someone know. And of course, no one was notified. And I was very happy I actually ended up being in the room. But yes, I suppose things are easing with COVID now, and so fewer masks are being worn, but you can actually purchase masks that have a clear, I guess, section built into them, and those are really good. I think they do fog up sometimes, so that is a problem, but I suppose if you're standing at 1.5 meters away from someone doing the social distancing and just sort of, moving your mask, I suppose, while you're addressing them, that could be really helpful. But beyond that, I'm not really sure, sorry.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I didn't realize that they made masks that were clear.
Yeah, they do. I'm not sure where you purchase them from, but I'm sure the big sort of health companies would distribute them.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I did purchase some of the clear ones. It was a bit like being in a swimming pool because, they really sweated and fogged up. But if there was a really good reason to wear them, they'd be well worthwhile. And they weren't, I bought them through a small group of people who were distributing them.
Thank you, Libbi. We've just had another question come through for you, Jessica. Someone said that they've noticed that you wrote, lowercase d / uppercase D deaf in your presentation, and they'd like to know the significance of that.
Sure. Sorry, I probably should have unpacked that a little bit. So the capital D deaf refers to people who identify as culturally deaf. So, that they use AUSLAN to communicate the sort of deaf pride, ideas of deaf gain, that kind of thing. And the lowercase d is the audiological fact of deafness. So that's used often in scholarship, that's used just to refer to the fact that someone is audiologically deaf. And then the D kind of / capital D is often used to show the mixed kind of nature of those things. So someone can be audiologically deaf, but also culturally deaf, if that makes sense. And that's a spectrum as well. People identify very differently.
Awesome. Thank you so much for clearing that up.
Nice.
I think we'll move on to our next speaker now, and then maybe we can have some more time at the end for more general questions. But thank you again so much, Jessica. That was honestly so valuable, and we feel so privileged to have heard some of your story and some of your insight.
Thank you. Real pleasure to be here. Thanks for being my test dummies. Or my audience. Thank you.
So our next speaker tonight is Libbi. So Libbi is a speech pathologist who works with a range of people who have communication barriers. So her main areas of interest include use of keyword signing, alternative or augmentative methods of communication, and non-verbal forms of communication for patients with communication barriers. So welcome, Libbi, and I'll just pass over to you now.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is using the AUSLAN signs, but in a different way than using them in an AUSLAN language, because all of the signs that are used in keyword sign are from the AUSLAN vocab, the AUSLAN language, including the differences between states. So in Victoria, keyword sign is using the variations of AUSLAN that would be particular to Victoria, and similarly if you're in New South Wales or a different state. But they are they're using AUSLAN signs, they're not separate signs. So it's a very simplified, extremely simplified version of AUSLAN signing. And it's designed to be used by and with people who have communication difficulties, but there won't be people who are deaf. It uses, as I've said, AUSLAN signs, but it uses speech with the signs, and we use spoken word order, which is quite different to AUSLAN. So that key thing is that it's not a separate sign language itself. It's just a vocab of AUSLAN signs that are being used to give extra information for spoken English. So if you're looking at it in that sort of comparison, the obvious differences between them. So with keyword sign, the person can hear, but they're having difficulty communicating. Either they can't talk at all, or their speech is really hard to understand. And clearly, people who are using AUSLAN, the deaf community, are not able to hear. In keyword sign, you always talk when you're signing, whereas AUSLAN is a language that's a sign language. You don't talk necessarily. We don't talk with it. AUSLAN has its own unique grammar, whereas in keyword sign, you're following spoken English word order. But in keyword sign, you're using all the characteristics of AUSLAN to add the extra information to just the sign itself. So you're using all the natural gesture, and you're using all the sign production techniques that go with AUSLAN. But yeah, you're not using that unique grammar. So you always speak when you're signing. You use normal grammatical sentences when people are learning to use keyword sign, and And it kind of fits with what Jessica was saying. If you learn keyword sign, you know some AUSLAN signs. So it gives you a starting point. Even if somebody wasn't a fluent AUSLAN user themselves, if you knew some keyword signs, you'd be able to communicate much more than if you had nothing. But you always use normal grammatical sentences. When people are learning keyword signing, they tend to use much shorter, simpler, slower talking. And that's actually really good for somebody with a communication impairment. But as they become more used to it and as they learn more signs, they can begin to use a normal speed and grammar. You're only signing keywords, and those keywords that they use from the AUSLAN vocab will be used generically. So instead of learning all the different types of signs, say to go with different foods, they might just use that generic sign for food. Or drink, they'll just use the generic sign for drink. They won't do it. So they might be saying, you know, we're going to drink some milk, we're going to have a cup of tea. Depending on the person, they'll stick with a generic sign, keeping it simple. They're using all the facial expression and body language that AUSLAN's so well known for. And again, with facial expressions, a good example of how they keep it relatively simple. So you might say something's good, you might say something's fantastic by showing it on your face, or you might just do a double sign rather than have all the different signs to show that something's, you know, good versus fantastic versus wonderful. They'll keep it, as I said, down to those core basic signs. And they only teach the signs that are relevant for a person. They're using, so again, it's keeping the language demands down to a simple level, and they're just adding with the keyword sign, they're adding that additional information. So why would you use keyword sign? You would use it to help people with understanding. So for people who've got a receptive language impairment, so it's very difficult for them for lots of reasons to be able to comprehend what people are saying. If you're using some nice discrete keyword signs when you're talking to them, it just makes a lot more sense, much easier for them to comprehend what's being spoken. It can be used by people temporarily or as a long-term thing in terms of supplementing their speech. If they're really hard to understand, or only people that know them really, really well are able to understand their talking, it gives them another option for being able to get their message across clearly. And for people who can't talk at all, it gives them an option for being able to communicate. And when you're using keyword signing, you're supporting that idea that everybody has different ways of communicating. And so being able to use visual, you'll always in doctors' surgeries, there's always lots of visual stuff around that you can point to, or little models you can show people. But then it's this other option of being able to make the message clearer and simpler for people, depending on what they need to be able to communicate. Okay, so just the basic, you know, that differentiation. Augmentative is just to add to the speech you've got. Alternative is to use instead of speaking. So there's lots of options in terms of ways to communicate. They're either unaided or they're aided. So the unaided options, we are using ourselves all the time, our body movements, our facial expressions, the natural gestures that we add. People who have communication difficulties will often make their own little signs up. Lots of miming. Keyword sign fits here as being something that you don't need to have something extra with you. It's always with you because it's just your hands. And so that makes it a very, very flexible, easy to use, always with you means of communicating. And of course, AUSLAN and finger spelling are there as unaided options. Aided options with the AAC, augmentative and alternative communication, go through a whole range. we are very familiar ourselves with using spelling, with using whole words, but also with using diagrams, pictures, photos to add to our communication. And so we're always saying, you know, look at this, you know, especially photos now with people with their phones. And so we're adding to our verbal communication. Much easier to show someone a photo and then talk about it than try and talk about it without the photo. But people with communication difficulties will use real objects they're pointing to in the environment. They might use object symbols with an early developmental level around communication. So they might be using, understand that, you know, the towel means we're going swimming, the key means we're going out in the bus, your hat means you're going to go for a walk, the purse means we're going shopping. So that idea of symbolising key things with an object, and then that whole range of photos, pictures, moving on into text-to-speech type options. Now, keyword sign, you're looking at it in that developmental level, it sits with really the photos, pictures. So it fits in really well at that early level for people who are developing their communication skills, or young children who are just getting started. Added to this whole aided side now is all the electronic options that weren't there 20 years ago. They were there 20 years ago, but they weighed a huge amount. They had very short batteries and they were usually breaking down. Whereas now they're cheaper, they're much more reliable, and they're smaller. So there's all sorts of options now electronically to assist people with communication. And often people who are coming in, ideally, I know Jessica said you would be wanting to ask people, you know, what's your preferred means of communication for anybody who has a communication impairment? And people will have, hopefully with them, if they use an electronic device or a communication book, communication board, you want them to have those things with them. And it means that you as a medical practitioner would be wanting to be reasonably familiar and comfortable to support them using those things. When we're looking at supporting people who have difficulty communicating, it's really important to remember the range of reasons of why we communicate. It's not just to say which bits are hurting. It's not just to ask for the drink or the toilet. They're really common ones that are seen. You'll see them. A lot of hospitals will have now, if you need them, they have communication boards that they can provide to people who come in who don't have any means of communication, or their communications options have been limited by whatever they're in there for. But they're often very, very much focused on those basics of where does it hurt and what do you need? But our communication is all about, really, the bulk of what we do every day is just social interaction. It doesn't contain any major new information. It's not earth-shattering, it's not essential for getting us what we need, other than that need for connection. So the chat that we do is really, really important. And that's something that for people who are using an alternative system has now been added in to all of their communication systems that wasn't there 20 years ago. 20 years ago, they were assumed they just wanted a drink, they wanted to go to the toilet, they wanted to eat something. Whereas now it's this full range of asking questions themselves, not just responding, of being able to have that option to comment on things, to say how fantastic something is, or the reverse of how awful something is. But all of that is really important in any communication system. And with keyword sign, they introduce signs across that full range in their vocab to allow a full range of communication functions. So it's really important that we establish whatever it is that person uses as a shared means of communication. When we're using a backup system, whether that's keyword sign or whether it's a communication book or a board or a device or text to speech on a computerized system, It's visual. It provides that backup that is really concrete. It's stable. It stays there for people to see for much longer than talking does. We say a word and it's gone. Whereas even with a sign, you've got that visual backup that is, you can slow it down if you need to for people. You can emphasize it if you need to. Well, with speech, it's gone. It's very often very concrete, very guessable. And even with your signing, especially the earlier ones that might be key ones used, they're very easy to guess, and often a lot of them are contained within natural gesture that people are very comfortable with. There's some options in here that are these are just examples of things that you may see. Somebody coming in may have a backup system that's actually about telling you, the person who's the communication partner, what things mean for this person if they're trying to respond or communicate with you. So a communication passport or a personal communication dictionary, they'll be describing particularly, what that person does, what it means, and then how the best way to respond to that. There's lots of ways of using stuff that is much more object-based, but lots around understanding the routines that are required, things that need to be done, lots of schedule type things. And then you've got your technology type options. And you can have really quite complex communication books now. Again, because I'm older, I can remember where you photocopied, coloured in, cut and paste, and use contact to make backup communication systems for people, or alternative communication systems. Whereas now, of course, it's all computerised, it's all laminated. It's so easy to make really beautiful and very durable, but also communication systems that are able to be updated and added to all the time. So if somebody had health issues, they may have a communication system that has the ability to be able to talk about that in a lot of detail, even if they're working at a picture level. Okay. So the keyword sign use of AUSLAN signs, it's not a question of choosing would we do keyword sign or would we have a communication device or would we have a communication book. It's working out what works for that person, and that will all be determined by who they're communicating with, what environments they're going into, and what's the easiest for them to use. One of the issues with keyword sign alone is that a lot of people don't understand it, particularly if they're using signs that are not the easy to guess type signs. So they will need something else with it. So they'll need a communication book or a device as well. And so you tend to see people having that idea of having what they used to call total communication, or where you have multiple options for communicating with. So not everyone can learn to use signs themselves, but anyone who has a comprehension issue, who has an intellectual disability, would be able to be assisted by keyword signing for their understanding of what's being spoken. Okay. The sign production features of keyword sign, it's probably not really appropriate to go into it too much, but all of these are part of AUSLAN, and keyword sign has used those within the keyword sign, what they're teaching with keyword sign. So the directionality of, if you're saying to go, you're actually using the direction of where it is. You're making a picture in the air with the signs that you're using. Where you place things, we're going to put it over here or we're going to put it over here. Again, it's that idea of you're using the sign to actually make a visual picture for the person. And you're always adding in the facial expression and the body language. And for people who are not learning how to do do proper AUSLAN and who are not deaf, it can be quite difficult for them to learn to add all of these features in when they're doing the signing. We tend to be, with our communication, very limited in what we add to speaking with people. As a culture, we tend to be a bit reserved. And so doing keyword signing makes people so much more interesting. So if somebody, in terms of keeping the attention of someone who has difficulty focusing, keeping the attention of someone who has difficulty and it's really tiring for them to be able to comprehend what's going on and comprehend what they're hearing, when you're doing keyword sign, you become a much more interesting person to watch and listen to. So even if they're not comprehending the signs themselves, it often has huge benefits just for them being able to focus more on what's being said. So for comprehension, it's providing visual information to go with what you're saying. Signs last longer than speech. It promotes and maintains attention and eye contact. And signs often look like what they mean. So you're at the pub and you're saying, you know, would you like a drink, because you're on the other side there? You're using a keyword sign. You're using an AUSLAN sign for drink. You want something to eat. They're things, you know, a lot of our gestures, they're all, they become close to, or they are actual signs from the AUSLAN vocab. And it promotes good language models, because if people are using keyword signs, signing the key words of what they're saying, it slows them down, tends to make them use more direct and shorter sentences, both of which make it easier for people to be able to understand what's being spoken. In terms of somebody using keyword sign to be able to express themselves, to be able to communicate expressively, they're easier to produce than speech. The muscles that are required and the coordinated movements required for speech are very complex if they're difficult for somebody. And so a lot of the signs can be made relatively easily. So they're much easier to produce at that motor level than speech. It extends a developmental skill that a person's already learning and using. So people are already learning to use gestures themselves. And so you're adding to that. It promotes speech attempts and communication success. With small children, when it's being talked about being used with kids who've got a developmental delay, there's always a concern about if they use keyword signing, they won't learn to talk. And all the studies that have been done say that that doesn't happen. It's much more likely to speed up their ability to develop spoken communication. And at its worst, it has no impact on their ability to develop spoken language. It doesn't have any negative impact at all. And it will always assist their comprehension. It assists others to understand their speech, and it promotes the use of language while speech is developing. And it reduces their frustration, and so therefore reduces behaviour issues in kids. So just looking at, I'm just looking at the time, and I'm over, sorry. If you're doing a keyword sign course, what they would teach you out of the AUSLAN vocabulary, they'll go through finger spelling, they'll go through natural gestures, and then they have two parts of an interactive vocab. And the interactive vocab focus is really around that range of communication functions. So if you were able to learn what is actually it looks like a lot of signs, but it's not, and they're really quite simple once you've used them a few times to remember. A lot of them are very similar if they look like what they are, it would actually open up a huge range of options for you to use. And if you did have someone come in who was using AUSLAN, they're AUSLAN signs, so at least it would give you a little bit of a starting point to be able to communicate. And also to comprehend what they might be trying to tell you. So there is Keyword Sign Australia, lots of resources. They do have an app. Yeah, there's lots of resources available. But the keyword sign also has had an increase in demand for requests for people wanting to do training with COVID. So I guess it's the same spin-off, people being much more interested in just signing generally. Okay.
Thank you so much, Libbi. That was such an awesome talk. So interesting to hear about, you know, all these different communication methods, the keyword signing, which I personally had not really heard about before this talk tonight. And, you know, how these are all different and how they fit together. And I think it was really interesting as well, the point that you made about how much of communication is also about social interaction and connection with other people, and how it's not just about, you know, expressing like a basic request or a basic need. I think that's a really valuable thing for us all to kind of remember.
So keyword sign would be used in all of your specialist schools, it is being used a lot more across the board with kids that are slow to develop their communication skills. Yeah, so it's quite common, and yeah, as I say, it is AUSLAN signs, but it's not AUSLAN language.
We've had a question come through from Darren, who was asking if you might be able to give an example of an English sentence using keyword signing. And then he'd like to contrast that with AUSLAN.
Oh, yeah, that would be good. Because what you might, let me, okay. So you might say, I want more, and there's more over there. So I've just done 3 signs. I want more, and my face is showing the question. I want more. There's more over there. And then I've got 2 signs for that one.
Right, thank you. And I'll just pass over to Darren, and I'll let everybody sort of scroll to see if they can find him so that he can sign for us how he would say that sentence in AUSLAN.
Darren, if you actually make a noise, it might pop up.
Yeah.
Say mute off. Mute. Yeah, mute's on.
There we go. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. When I'm teaching AUSLAN, I always teach AUSLAN and keyword signing. Both, because both are important.
Yeah.
When one classic example is what I am going to the shops.
Yep.
Okay, that's keyword sign.
Yep.
So talk and sign the keyword at the same time. I am going to the shops. AUSLAN, what? Shop me go, but without voice.
Yeah, it's a different word order.
The expression makes the difference. So signing and talking, keyword sign, I am going to the shops. So AUSLAN. Okay, that's my example. I just want to say it's really important for like medical students at the moment and in the past. The first people that deaf families see with their deaf child are doctors. And doctors say, what, better to have cochlear implant, hearing aid, AUSLAN, but no good. Yeah. So it's really important to think about the person that give the families options. My business itself have many like children cochlear, but then they decide when they're 1, 2, 3 that change become AUSLAN. But at that time, at 3, 4, 5, they're behind with the language development, especially if they're not talking. Keyword signing is used with people with disability who can hear like good, but can't express themselves. Children with autism, intellectual disability, Down syndrome, they use keyword signing. So when we teach AUSLAN to families with deaf children, and keyword signing is given to families with children with disabilities. But it's really important to give the children a language from as early as possible. And that's the biggest mistake we're making at the moment in the medical area. Yes, cochlears and hearing aids are brilliant. And yes, deafness needs to be fixed. But at the moment, we have deafness in the world. So we need to give the children a language. We need to give the families a language, because children without language means frustration, can't communicate, can't express. And that is the biggest issue, I think, at the moment. So I'm just getting up my hobby horse, okay?
In schools, they used to teach something called signed English. So they would be signing every little word. And so if they were talking about cats, they would put the S on the end. Like they signed all of the little words, and they thought that would help children who were deaf to be able to learn to read more easily. And of course it didn't. So they were signing AUSLAN in their community. They were doing signed English at school, and it didn't assist them when they then went to let the children develop their language really well with AUSLAN and have a really sound language skill. Then that was what helped with literacy. Because once you needed to be competent in a language first to be able to then go on with the literacy.
Thank you so much, Darren and Libby. I think in the interest of time, we might move on to our third speaker for tonight, and then at the end, we can allocate maybe a little bit more time for questions depending on how we go. But yeah, thanks again so much, Libby. That was such an awesome presentation. And we're so lucky to have heard from you tonight. So our next and final speaker for tonight is Josh. So Josh was born profoundly deaf and is fluent in both English and AUSLAN. He is a psychology PhD student at Macquarie University, and his PhD topic is on creating a new psychometric that will help professionals better understand their clients' disability in order to better address their needs. So on to you now, Josh.
Okay, should I start now? Okay, can you hear me clear?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to work out the volume of my voice, because I haven't done a Zoom presentation before, so.
Oh, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Sorry I don't have any slides, but I'll try my best to be clear. I'm aware it's a bit of an ironic thing that I'm talking about the importance of sign language, and if AUSLAN is actually my first language, but I thought it would just be an easier way of expressing myself on Zoom. Okay, so I realise this topic is on mental health in the deaf community, but this talk would be a general focus on a range of factors that does end up having an impact on deaf people's mental health. The reality is there isn't a lot of research on mental health in the deaf community around the world, let alone the Australian deaf community. And as far as I know, there isn't a deaf psychologist in Australia. So clearly much more work needs to be done in a holistic sense. So there's some important general information about deaf people and mental health. There's an inherent difficulty in collecting information or accurate information about deaf mental health. But it's been noted that the general prevalence of mental health issues is a lot higher in the deaf population than in hearing populations. So deaf people are more likely to experience suboptimal developmental trajectories than a typically developing person. So then a high proportion of deaf people experience developmental and language delays, and commonly as a result, cognitive, social and emotional development across deaf people is very inconsistent. And there's a higher degree of depression and anxiety in deaf people than hearing people. The suicide rate is a little bit unclear. It's not really a clear difference, but it's definite that the rate of depression is higher. And a portion of deaf people do also have additional disabilities and complex mental health issues. So comorbidity is common. And deaf people are pretty vulnerable to abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, range of traumas. So they often have lower self-esteem, self-efficacy, resilience, psychological flexibility, all the therapy buzzwords. And they constantly experience rejection, oppression, discrimination in their lives. So, philosophically speaking, they are disabled in a sense that they embody pathology. So in a way, they don't know they can, or they believe they can't, or they don't have the potential. So that's why deaf culture and deaf pride is so important, because in a way it inoculates them from internalizing this negative script, which can give rise to depression, anxiety, isolation, learned helplessness, and other mental health issues. Because what deaf culture does is teaches them, raises them to believe they're fine being deaf. Some can be really proud and some can be pretty, yeah, I don't care, it doesn't bother me. There's a really good section in the Australian Deaf Mental Health Report that was done in 2015. There was a psychologist named Alana Roy. She has some AUSLAN training, not a fluent signer, but she has some experience working in the deaf community as a psychologist. And she did bring up some interesting insights into significant barriers regarding mental health in the deaf community. So there's a few things. First one is the stigma and shame. So deaf people are worried about losing face in the community. So disclosure can be challenging in these communities. And many worry about shame, stigma, not getting jobs, losing face, no longer being seen as a role model and advocate. So they're dealing with a bit of taboo. There's also gossiping and lack of trust, which is incredibly prevalent in the deaf community, unfortunately. So relational aggression is very common. There's also autism and a medical model to deal with that definitely needs to be fixed. And this makes deaf people feel very inferior, inadequate, broken, insufficient. And there's a lack of access to service and communication in general. And there's a real difficulty to be able to access self-harm and suicide support via text, Skype, interpreters, and emails. But this was done in 2015. Lifeline now provide a text crisis service. I've been working for them for the last 5 months as their text crisis supporter. So that's one way they can do it. But it doesn't mean that not all deaf people can benefit from that anyway, because they may feel like they can't express themselves in English and they can only do it in sign language. So I don't know about the options about sign language for crisis support. The psychologist also observed common mistakes made by hearing and deaf mental health professionals when they're working with deaf and deafblind clients in crisis. They pretend or assume they can understand or sign. They sign or understand the client. So communication can be very very unclear and not optimal. They don't have adequate training and skills in deaf-blind trauma and risk assessment. They also have a bit of autism. They assume they know more or are correct because they can hear. They're privileged of being able to hear. And they don't consult with the deaf and deaf-blind specialists in the community, which is very important because that makes sure you're able to meet their needs. And she also mentions that there are mistakes that deaf mental health professionals do make, which is they assume they know the client because they grew up with them or they have managed their case for such a long time, which is a bit of a real ethical problem from a psychologist's point of view, because you're really confusing and blowing the boundaries, which is not ideal. And while they've been able to communicate effectively, they don't have good clinical risk assessment skills. And assuming that deaf and deaf-blind clients should want deaf or deaf-blind professionals to support them, so they're reluctant to engage with hearing professionals. So these are typical issues that can arise when it comes to accessibility for deaf people and mental health services. I have personally seen a psychologist, and I've chosen not to have interpreters, as I do feel like I would not be able to express myself properly with likely someone I know in the room, because I think I probably know all interpreters. It's a very small community. And I would also feel that the professional would not behave normally with the interpreter in the room, because that would sort of compromise the therapeutic dynamic between us. Because the big chunk of therapy is making a connection, and then that's how the therapeutic outcome works out well, depending on the connection. So it's clear there are numerous issues surrounding the deaf community, which can and does have an impact on mental health and developmental trajectories as well. There's one thing that's popped up, and that's autism. That word has popped up a few times now. So this was coined by the academic Tom Humphreys, but that was popularised by Halad and Lane. He wrote a book called Marks of Benevolence. It's a pretty old book now. It's aged, not really aged really well, but I think the core message of the book is brilliant, and I think it's worth a read. So autism can be defined as a term used to describe negative attitudes towards people with hearing loss. So it's typically thought of as a form of discrimination, prejudice, oppression, or a general lack of willingness to accommodate those who cannot hear. I should note that deaf people are also capable of autism themselves. It often comes across as relational aggression, shame, guilt, gossiping, infighting, or self-oppression. And if I could make the claim, it's pretty similar to African American or even women, historically speaking. They will hold themselves back. If you see one going ahead and say, no, you should stay in your role as you were told to. So autism can be expressed in many different ways, but fundamentally, the core dynamic of it is not perceiving, treating, interacting with or including deaf people as persons. So that can mean disrespecting them, excluding them, or not including them properly, because inclusion can sometimes be an illusion. Just having them in the room when something's happening, that's not always inclusion. So people often confuse that. It can be an illusion. Or they just don't meet their needs, simple as that. So the consequence of this dynamic is twofold. One, it disrupts their development over time, limiting their potential and reaching optimal use of their body. And two, it disrupts their current experience in terms of biological, psychological, and social factors. So, for example, the perceived potential of deaf people is a lot less than the average person. So this perceived potential is projected onto deaf children as they grow up. it's likely they could internalize that. It's like you could tell them, you're not good enough to do this, you shouldn't do it. So, for example, when I was young, in a hearing school in the countryside in New South Wales, a school principal thought I would not graduate high school because she thought I was not performing on it typically, or not good enough, basically. I have now 3 degrees and I'm working on my PhD, so you shouldn't assume, you shouldn't project. Be careful about that. And generally disregarding the needs of deaf people, whether intentionally or unintentionally, so be aware of that. Not putting in the effort to communicate, or they prioritise speaking and hearing at the expense of healthy cognition and development. So they override the importance of sign language, which has been found to reliably support healthy development. And there are many people in prominent positions have made unfounded claims that it would be confusing for deaf children to learn sign language because it would stop them from being able to speak. This has been the mantra since the 1880s, since the Milan Conference, which has been a nightmare for deaf people since then. And it's still prominent now. You still hear people talk about that. Oh, sign language is going to stop people from learning to speak. It's ridiculous, and it's disproven. But yet people keep on holding on to that idea, that philosophy, and that's incredibly unethical and immoral. Another example of autism is, I feel like I'm repeating myself sometimes, but they're not meeting their needs and understanding the unique way of experiencing and being in the world, which is sort of a philosophical way of saying it. So you should treat deaf people as deaf people. If you treat deaf people as hearing people, it doesn't work. It's the same way that you treat a blind person as being able to see. It doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive and counterproductive. So you should really think about deaf epistemology. There's a paper out there which I think is worth reading, give you a background about what does it really mean to be deaf, the experience of being deaf, being very visually oriented and that sort of thing. So another one is limited access to information and resources that otherwise people take for granted in everyday life. So not being able to access education, medical or therapy services, even not being able to watch a movie with subtitles because people don't like subtitles. Why do I have to watch with subtitles on and actually click it off? It's very annoying. And deaf people also miss the privilege of picking up incidental information and knowledge across the lifespan. We learn a lot without being aware of it. So we have to make up for it and compensate for it. Like not being able to overhear conversations, like that's a big deal. So altogether, deaf people may feel frustrated, annoyed, upset, isolated, worried, or feel a sense of resignation and futility. They'll go, what's the point? I'll just stay home and not deal with it, because that's easy. I don't have to feel hurt. So they start protecting themselves, but it hurts them in the long run. And often having to organise things to be accessible can be daunting and exhausting. It really takes resilience, and not all deaf people are capable of that. And even if you do manage to organise something like an interpreter, there are still other issues in place that you have to contend with. So it can be really exhausting in the long run. And lastly, people promoting cochlear implants as secure and suggesting no rehabilitation, support, or sign language is needed. That's one of the worst aspects of autism that has happened, I think, like what Darren was saying. So I'll talk a little bit about cochlear implants now. The efficacy of cochlear implants are incomplete. They're often overstated and overestimated. It's a lot more complicated than the perceived notion of plug and play. It's not as simple as just turning it on and then let it do all the work, because it requires a lot of rehabilitation and support. There was an Australian qualitative study by Punch and Hyde in 2010 looking at psychosocial factors in children with cochlear implants. They found, I'm quoting the paper, there was positive experiences indicated around the children's psychosocial development with their cochlear implants, but also ongoing difficulties communicating in groups of people and problems relating to social skills. Some children had little contact with other deaf children with or without cochlear implants, despite parents and teachers perceiving such contact beneficial. And adolescence was also a particularly difficult time for some, as they struggled with feelings of self-consciousness about their deafness and external cochlear implant equipment, and worries about friendships, dating, and their future place in the world. There's also another paper I like to quote in the literature review section, and a paper by Wyatt et al. 2017. They say medical professionals are not able to assure that hearing aids and cochlear implants will result in positive language outcomes. Many deaf children are significantly delayed in language skills despite the use of cochlear implants. Large-scale longitudinal studies indicate significant variability in cochlear implant-related outcomes when sign language is not used, and there is minimal predictive knowledge of who might and who might not succeed in developing a language foundation using just cochlear implants. So it's clear that cochlear implants alone are not sufficient to guarantee language acquisition. So it's very important to view cochlear implants as a very helpful tool, but also a valuable one. So there's been a lot of claims made that the effectiveness of cochlear implants is associated with the intensity of rehabilitation programs, because there's a lot of work involved. So it's not necessarily the hearing devices per se, but the surrounding support as well. So it makes you think, if it's not guaranteed that the deaf child with a cochlear implant will succeed, does it not make sense to teach them to sign? At the very least, sign language is the best safety net you can give to them to ensure a good life. And on top of all that, cochlear implants are definitely valuable. I mean, I have one myself at a late age, and it really helped me. It's amazing. But they do break. They cost thousands of dollars. I mean, that's sort of the reason why in America the numbers of cochlear implants are low, because the health insurance is so expensive, but we have so much here. And as much as I appreciate my cochlear implant, and I do find myself less anxious about communicating with people, it has given me some issues, like batteries running out or breaking before important events. Like my batteries run out and I had a spare, and I put it in and it ran out because I didn't charge it. And that was right before my date. I was freaking out. And the same thing happened again when I was meeting my ex-parents. When my cochlear implant broke, you have to wait for a couple of weeks. So I was freaking out by the communication issues that would come up. You don't need that stress. And for a lot of deaf people, deaf anxiety is a real thing. So it often relates to not wearing hearing devices and not used to being deaf, because they're so used to being switched on. There's been some cases of young deaf children who don't sign. When you see them turn off their cochlear implants, they start freaking out. They just get so nervous. And you think, you should teach them that it's okay, teach them how to be deaf, then they could be less anxious. So that's something to think about, and I think some more research needs to be done in that area. So I'd like to quote the same paper again, just to lead to my next point. So while overall increased rates of mental health problems and extreme barriers to behavioural health care are reported in the deaf community population, the early access to family and peer communication are protective factors against these disparities. Indeed, some claim that the higher prevalence of trauma and psychiatric symptoms in the deaf community are partially caused by inappropriate and/or incomplete medical and educational language interventions early in life, which create risks for subsequent language deprivation and behavioural health problems. So, which brings me to this point. What could medical people do to help? Well, I can advise you 2 ways. The first one, you can learn to sign for immediate connection and communication. This may be extremely useful for especially an emergency situation. There's often a time gap between realising that the patient is deaf and then having to organise an interpreter and waiting for the interpreter to arrive. This could be costly depending on what the situation is. You might need to find out the information then. So if you have some basic sign and be able to communicate, you could get the information you need to be able to treat them. And also, while learning to sign, try to understand or be mindful of the complexity of deafness as a disability. Not all deaf people are the same, and everyone has very different language abilities. So you should consider this when you're communicating medical information. That you have to think about each deaf person as a case-by-case basis, because not everyone understands English well. They might give you the wrong information or consent to something like a medical procedure they do not fully understand, including the risks involved. So you really want to make sure that you really understand each other. So that first point is just mainly for the medical area. That means it's beneficial, you never know. The other way you could do is to give parents of deaf children proper advice, guidance and support so that the parent-child relationship can have a healthy start and a strong opportunity for optimal development. So be sure to suggest learning sign language to go with other intervention options like cochlear implants. Sign language can in fact help deaf people learn how to hear and speak, because it takes an active brain that experiences certainty, no doubt, to learn how to hear and speak and start creating networks, neural network and correlation. And you can't do this if you're constantly doubting yourself, what you hear and lip read. 30%, less than that, especially if you don't know English, and you're like, you can't build language that way. And this is a developmental psychology truism that helping parents establish expectations of raising deaf children is one of the most powerful things you can offer. So for my honours topic, which I'm trying to get published at the moment, I'm nearly getting there, I explored parenting experiences raising young deaf children using an online survey. When parents find out that the child is deaf, it's an incredibly overwhelming experience, which always involves grief. How they are supported through that and the expectations they are given will have an impact on how they feel about the grief and will impact on how they raise their child. So the survey asked several questionnaires, one on parenting morale, like how they feel about the parenting, perception of child vulnerability to illnesses, I know it's a funny measure, one on parenting styles, and a set of open questions relating to their experiences of the child being diagnosed as deaf and how they felt about it. I had to code the answers and determine if the diagnosis experience was resolved or unresolved. The most interesting result I found was that unresolved feeling of diagnosis, which means they haven't come to terms with the grief and they're still stuck in the past, there's no sense of hopefulness, that theoretically has an impact on how they relate to the child, the attachment style, the parent-child relationship in general. The unresolved feeling of diagnosis was linked to lower parenting morale and greater perception of child vulnerability to illnesses, which is funny because deafness has got nothing to do with susceptibility to illness. And yet, these parents thought that the child was vulnerable to illnesses. You know, if you could establish expectations there, they probably wouldn't fall into that kind of thinking, because they might end up being overprotective parents, which doesn't really help their growth. So what I suggested the most useful solution is try and have a mix of positive psychology and deaf epistemology. So you understand how deaf people experience the world and try to work with their way of experiencing the world. If you want to get their attention, you need to tap them on the shoulder and make sure there's eye contact. That's the only way they can really communicate and connect with you. If you talk to them like a hearing person and they're not even paying attention to you, it's not going to work. And I was talking to one parent. She said, my daughter also has so many questions we do not have answers for, such as, how come I'm the only one with hearing loss? So by educating parents about deafness and deaf epistemology, you can have positive outcomes for their deaf child, especially in terms of psychological resilience, where they can learn to embrace their deafness rather than see it as a lifelong burden, like I can't do it. Instead, you think, I can do it, I will try. So hopefully this gives you all some food for thought. One day you might be in a position where you will have a say and you will decide the fate of a parent who should have their child diagnosed with hearing loss. You never know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was such an incredible talk, and you've given us all so much to think about and so much to consider, which we're so grateful for. In particular, just like sort of your advice on how we can best, manage if we ever have a deaf patient, and how to sort of make sure that we give them the right advice, and keep their options open and not just automatically recommend cochlear implant without considering other really important factors. That was also valuable. And even some of the things that you mentioned earlier on about some of the challenges with accessing mental health help within the deaf community, because of how difficult it can be to sort of have maybe an extra person present in the room and all of that. That was really, really insightful. So thank you so much. I'll let people send some questions for you in the chat now. But I think we had some questions come through for you earlier as well. Do you have any sort of thoughts on how we can be better, maybe as future health practitioners, how we can be allies and advocates for, the deaf community or patients with communication barriers?
Was someone asking a question? Yeah, I completely missed it, sorry.
Sorry.
Could you write down the question?
Yes, I'll send it to you now. Sorry.
While you're sending that, people with a communication impairment generally are much more likely to have mental health issues. And there is a growing now interest in developing a range of resources, lots of visual resources to assist with working with people doing interventions around mental health issues for people who've got communication impairments.
Thank you, Libbi.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? I will probably have to go soon, and it's probably partially my fault, because we sort of discussed we go for probably just over an hour. We probably should have had 2 interpreters. Partly my fault. I'm happy to discuss that with you a bit later. But anything over 1 hour, especially of this content, is quite mentally and physically draining, as I'm sure you can imagine, for an interpreter.
Oh, yeah, of course. I totally understand that. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
Okay, no worries at all. That's completely fine. we, yep, no worries. I'll just get, no worries.
That's okay. I just wanted to let you know, like, I'm happy to
Yeah.
wrap it up, but yeah, I'm
Yeah,
just,
yeah, absolutely. Look, thank
Yeah.
you so much. And
No,
we'll just
no,
start to
that's
wrap
okay.
it up now.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. There was obviously a misunderstanding. I'm really sorry.
No, that's okay.
What we'll do is we'll skip ahead the questions now, and we'll make sure that we release a Q&A section afterwards in the chat.
Okay, that'd be helpful. But advice on how to best be allies and advocates for patients who are deaf. Yeah, I would say try not to make any assumptions and try to ask a lot of questions if you can, especially try and contact organisations in the deaf community. They're probably the best reliable place to start for more information and guidance and support on what to do with patients who are deaf, but also talk to the patients themselves with an interpreter in place. Check their needs, because not everyone wants the same sort of treatment. So it's sort of like personalised. They try to assume that everyone is different and then work with them instead of painting with a one big brush. Okay, another question is there particular issues with getting AUSLAN training to rural remote areas for deaf children in support networks? I'm not entirely sure, but I think so, because a lot of training they give are often in capital cities or big regional cities, but I think they make up for it with online training as well. I'm not completely sure on that, so we have to check with them organisation exactly what they offer, because I'm not sure. And with my...
Oh, sorry, I was being interrupted.
I think we might move ahead to just wrap it up and answer the rest of the questions through the Q&A, if that's okay. Josh, just because I'm mindful that Emma might have to head off soon. So we can just, jump onto the end of the conversation. Thank you so much. And then we can just, possibly release the answer to the questions at a later time. Okay. So just to finish up, thank you so much again to our incredible speakers tonight. It's just been so valuable hearing all of your insight, and it's given us so much to think about. So I'd just like to talk a little bit more now about our partners for the events. You've kind of already met Darren, but the AUSLAN Company was founded in 2004 by Darren Roberts, who is a deaf man. And today it is still the only deaf-owned and operated AUSLAN training organisation that offers AUSLAN to families of deaf children Australia-wide. So I've just got this short video that Darren's made to tell you guys a little bit about the course that is being on offer today. So I'll just play that for you now. And it's being signed as well. So Emma, you won't need to sign it, interpret it.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you? My name is Darren. I am the business owner of the AUSLAN Company. Welcome to Halad to Health. I hope you've enjoyed the event tonight, that you've learned many different things about the deaf community. My role is to provide a 23 places for you to learn AUSLAN Level 1. That course will give you the basic communication skill to communicate with any deaf person. That involves the 27 videos. You learn about 500 signs and plus 80 to 100 sentences. That video is not pretty formal. It's like this. Me stand here teaching you Auslan. There's no pretty drawing, graphics, just me standing and teaching like me teaching a class. At the end, if you want to receive your certificate in Auslan Level 1, you watch me signing and see if you understand my signing. Answer the questions and then film yourself and signing as well. You give it to a panel of deaf people. We yeah, that's really good. Facial expression perfect, body language perfect, the sign is accurate. And then we give you a certificate. If you sign bad, facial expression bad, body language bad, we ask you please again. The videos never stop, meaning you want to learn ABC and then later you forget ABC, go back to the videos. So it means you have live access to the videos. So you never have an excuse to forget Auslan signs. Hopefully the 20 people plus others want to learn to communicate in Auslan. You finish level 1, you can level 2. That have 2 deaf people sign with voice over from interpreter. A bit different, but more challenging. But challenges are good, right? That's how you learn. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the event. You've learned lots, that you enjoy learning Auslan in the future, and all the best to you as medical students. Hopefully one day meet deaf person you can break the ice and sign to them before interpreter arrives. You will receive many smiles because I deaf love people signing to them. Thank you and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Darren. So Sarah has sent in the chat a little bit more information about the AUSLAN Company, so you guys can all have a look at their awesome courses and everything that they offer. Sarah's also sent a link for the feedback form in the chat. So in order to enter the draw to win one of these free courses from the AUSLAN Company, please make sure that you fill this out completely, and 20 of those people will be selected to win one of the courses, which is so exciting. So while you're all doing that, I'd just like to thank you all again so much for coming tonight. I hope you had an amazing time and enjoyed this event as much as we enjoyed sort of organising it. And just another huge thank you again to our amazing speakers, Jessica, Libby and Josh. To our amazing partner for tonight, Darren and the AUSLAN Company, and to Emma, our fantastic interpreter. I'm really grateful that you stayed till the end, even though I know it went a little bit longer than we expected. Yeah, so thank you guys all so much. And we'll say goodbye to Emma now and let her go.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma.
No worries. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Just while people are filling their forms out and heading out, I will just play this short video from Halad.
My name is Dawood, and I'm a current second-year Bachelor's of Biomedical Science student at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Right now, we're at the City Gymnasium in Valencia City, where we've just finished a long day of giving lectures, healthcare lectures, on depression and suicide, and cyberbullying and social etiquette.
The best part of today is that they teach us how to prevent stress, how to help others also if they're okay, asking if they are okay. Because with that, I can able to make them feel they're not alone, and they feel that they're special because someone cares about their feelings.
This kind of session or initiative done by the DepEd is very crucial because we are now in the technological era, and we should be all literate on how to use the social media, how to use the technology in a proper way, o kanang dili ta makadaot sa uban nga tao because kanang ang danger nga pwede mabuk. So I hope nga ang tanan nga mga maka-appeal dinhi nga mga guests kay daghan silang matun-an so that they will be all literate and they will know how to avoid this kind of bullying, and they can spread more love and kindness to all. Thank you.
It was truly, truly, truly a wonderful experience, and something that I will forever cherish for the rest of my life.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending tonight.
Thank you. It's been really interesting and very educational for me too.
Thank you. Thank you again to our speakers. We're so privileged to have had you come on today.
Thank you for having us.
All right, that's everything for tonight. So good night to our lovely attendees. Thank you all so much for coming.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really great. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Very awesome. Thank you for tonight. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll see you soon.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, Darren, you go. Oh, you go, you go. Hold on, there should be, there are still 7 people. Cool, do we still have Darren on the line?
Yes.
And Jess and Libby and Josh. Cool, our Halad team is here. still. Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. I think that I'm mind blown at how insightful that was. And